Every year I try to bring a report on what's happening in research. Kettering is a research foundation, not a grant maker. I always say that so that you're not unduly disappointed and overly attentive. This is a new organization, but it's a unique one. There's not another organization like this in the state of Alabama. And it's just beginning to realize its potential. So one of the first thing, I only got 4 reports, and the first one is about something that's happening in the field of organization that's very interesting. If you've read a book called The Spider and the Starfish, it's a story about new ways of organizing things that is having a powerful effect. The illustration, I think in the book, comes from the music business. I'm not familiar with it, but I was fortunate to have dinner last night with somebody and a group who were well informed on the subject. And in my day, if you wanted to buy music, you went to a music company and you bought the sheet music, or you bought a record or something. Those companies don't exist anymore. People go to Amazon, they don't pay for it, they download the music, there's an app there or something, you pay some small fee for it, but a whole industry disappeared. It was what the book called a spider. If you cut a spider in half, you have a dead spider. On the other hand, if you cut a starfish in half, you got 2 starfish. It will regenerate itself. So this organizational research is about regeneration and resilience. And it's beginning to come into the field that you're in, into not-for-profit work. And what we're trying to monitor in our research is the way these new starfish behave. Their strategy is not so much based on what they produce themselves, their programs, their artifacts, their publications, but what they can precipitate. And that's important because you can precipitate a lot more than you can produce. And the way they go about precipitating things as a catalyst is interesting because they do it by making connections between people. So in the language of that literature, they are strengthening the civic infrastructure of a community. We had an illustration of it when we were doing some studies of leadership. We found 2 types. One were the doorkeepers. If you want to do this, you need to go see the banker, you need to go see the president of the company. Doorkeepers. These other leaders were door openers. If you're thinking about doing that, go see Mark Birdie. He knows something about that. Go see this person. Talk to Fred. Talk to Sam. Talk to Helen. They were making connections. And they were being much more effective than they were simply by developing projects. I'll give you a concrete example from Alabama. Mark Wilson is here somewhere. Mark, yeah. This has to do with the bicentennial and the Creek War. Mark and his colleagues in history developed a issue book on the Creek War. And by an issue book, I meant they looked at the decisions that were involved in launching that war. And it was done from the point of view of the Indian tribes, the Creek Indians. And the options were, well, look, we've got all of these folks coming in. We can just get out of here, get out of there. You know, they're not particularly nice people. They speak funny language, and let's just go. Another group said, no, this is our land. We've got to stay here, and we've got to defend it. And a third group said, I don't know, maybe we need to learn to change our ways and live with these groups. So history was presented as a series of choices, not a series of inevitabilities. And then that group of historians teamed up with historical societies. Carrie Dunaway in Clark County, the Clark County Historical Society. All of the battle sites for the Creek War spread across the state were eligible to do that. And then they formed partnerships with teachers' organizations. Now that's a network. And what the possibilities are even more than doing something to recognize the importance of the Creek War in the state's history. There is an opportunity here, if you push on it, to see if we can't get local history back into the curriculum. Kids grow up now in school, they're taught history, but nothing about their own place and their own people. And we know that that grounding has a lot to do with how stable and confident young people are in the future. So there's an opportunity here, if we push on this, that this coalition, this network can do. It doesn't have an office, it's not incorporated anywhere. It's simply a network of connections built around some common interest. And maybe we can begin to teach history not as inevitability, but as human choice. And once kids get that point, they will understand that not the past, but the future depends on the choices they make and whether they exercise good judgment or not. So there's a lot of potential in these new ways of organizing. And I say it here because this is a new organization. It's doing great work, but it's not yet exhausted its potential. There are other ways of organizing this work that we all need to look at to see if it can't extend our reach and improve our effectiveness. So that's my first report. Now, the second has to do with, before I leave that, I want to talk about, and I noticed on your program, stories of local history. There was a section there on it. That's another potential partner for this work, because stories of what happened in the community, folk tales, legends, those kind of things, are a very powerful way for a community to influence the education of young people. There's a case in Alabama where the senior citizens came in and they told what it was like to be in this town when they were growing up. And the music department then took those stories and turned them into songs, and those songs were then sung back in a concert for the community, all right? So the community was educating, and it was using local history turned into songs. It was a wonderful coalition between, well, coalition is too strong a word because there wasn't any organization that did it. It was just putting things together, network building. So that's my first point. The second thing I wanted to talk about, and if you'd like to know more about that, Mark Wilson and can tell you. The folks here at the center can tell you about that if you're interested. The second thing I wanted to talk about is communities. I said last time that people in the country are turning to their communities to solve problems. Maybe it's because they're frustrated with Washington, I don't know why. But that has really continued, and I noticed that in your program, I read down it, you got it, because there are any number of things that have to do with communities. And that's important because there are some things that only citizens can do. There are some things that only citizens can do. Eleanor Ostrom, that I cited before, won the Nobel Prize by demonstrating that even our best and most powerful institutions, our courts, our hospitals, our schools, can't really do their job with what she called the co-production of public goods. All right. The illustration I always use is in health. The very fine medical facilities that we have can care for you, but they can't care about you. Only your friends and your family can care about you. And now we know that caring about others is in fact itself a powerful medicine that you can identify pharmautically. So you're on top of that, you have panels on it. But there is a problem, I think, that we need to face up to, and that is that something is happening in this country that's different, and it's dangerous, and it's contagious. We've always had differences. We've always had competition. We've always had disputes. But the divisiveness that's sweeping the country is something else. And I don't know of anybody that really understands it. I mentioned it before last year, and it's worse this year. So it grows. It's contagious. It's the person that I'm opposing is not only my adversary, they're my enemy. They are a subhuman species. And I'll use any means that I can to get rid of them. That contrasts so markedly with the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement motto was, you can hate the sin, but don't hate the sinner. Forgiveness. These were ministers. Forgiveness. Now it's take no prisoners. And it is spreading, and nobody that I know really understands it. And you know, with factions in every community, you add divisiveness and meanness on top of it, and you make it impossible for people to come together to do the things they need to do to have the kind of life they want to have. The third point has to do with another uptick since I talked to you last. There's a real increased interest in deliberative forums. Now the word deliberation is used in a lot of different ways. Let me tell you the way I'm using, because not that it's the best or the right way, it's just different. What I mean by deliberation is the exercise of the human faculty for judgment, okay? And what these deliberative forums do, particularly the national issues forums do, is that they will take an issue. I just described one for the Creek War, and they will lay out at least 3 options, because if you get 2, you invite polarization. And we found that deliberation is an antidote or a counter to divisiveness because of 2 reasons. One, it's very practical. It's very practical. We exchange research with over 1,000 civic educational organizations in the U.S. and over 100 countries. Some of them are here seated at the table. I see Pakistan, I see Russia, I see Fiji, I see Colombia. And in Israel, they had spent years getting funding to talk and try to understand one another. And they have a group there called Citizens Accord. There are secular Jews, there are Orthodox Jews, there are ultra-Orthodox Jews, there are Ethiopian Jews, these are all Israelis. There are Bedouin Israelis, there are Palestinian Israelis. And none of the groups, no one in one group likes anybody in the other groups. They have an ancient history. So they sit and they get to understand one another and tell me your story and what's your life like. And they did. At the end of this, they understood each other better. And what they understood is that they really didn't like one another. So they started working on some practical problems. In this village, let's see if we can't do something about the water. We don't have any water, and what we have is bad. Let's see if we can't do something. Water, clean water, is not a religious issue, really, except in some limited senses. It's not a theological issue. It's just a health issue. So they begin to work on these practical problems. And what do you know? They found that people who, they didn't necessarily like one another, but they learned the most important lesson of life, and that is they needed one another. They needed one another. They couldn't solve these problems unless, they didn't wind up loving one another and putting their arms around each other. They didn't come to any agreement, but they came to understand one another the way you understand people when you work with them. And that seems to be working for them in a way that just sitting down and discussing and understanding does not. So deliberation is getting more attention. There is a project brewing now on the 2020 election. There is a major national news organization that believes that the coverage in the press on the last election left a lot to be desired. And they are interested in the difference between what you get from a poll, which is what people think when they aren't thinking, and what you get from deliberation, which provokes people to think because they've got decisions to make. They've got choices, they've got options, and every one of those choices has some advantage and it has some disadvantage. And having to struggle with that causes them to have to exercise their faculty for judgment. And so there is a coalition forming between the National Issues Forum Institute, headed by President Bill Mathews, who's former president of Auburn, to concentrate on three issues that the newspapers have selected for their focus for the elections. Immigration is one, healthcare is, I think, the second one, and the third one, not yet quite defined, has to do with the economy. So there's going to be an effort to have forums across the country, deliberative forums across the country, to see what they produce and compare that with what's coming out of polls and other groups. A major national public broadcast station is involved. If this comes on, it will be a real breakthrough in getting people to understand what is distinctive about deliberation and what role it plays, because the legitimacy of our major institutions really depends on their being deliberative bodies. We trust the court system because it's a deliberative body. We trust the legislature because it's supposed to be a deliberative body. And when it is no longer that, what do you know? We lose confidence in those institutions. So here's a chance not only to do election coverage, perhaps in a better way, but here is an opportunity to build the deliberative capacity of this country, which I think is crucial. My fourth point, my final point, is I'm afraid a troubling one. Democracy is in trouble. I don't think I would ever say that. I grew up right in the aftermath of the Second World War. We fought that war to save the world from democracy. Democracy was not a contested value. It is today. It is today. The United States, on the index of democracies, we used to stand at the top. We're down maybe in the middle rank at best. I can tell you from the work we do with other countries that there is a sense that the United States is a declining power, that its best days are over, and that one need not pay too much attention to the U.S. because it is faltering. And that is a widely held view. Democracy is in trouble. And one of the symptoms of that trouble is the loss of confidence in all of our major institutions, beginning with the Congress of the United States, the entire federal establishment, other major institutions that were once valued as any authoritative institution is suffering from a loss of public confidence. And so one of the research projects that we're working on is to suggest, we took a page from Mr. Lincoln's wonderful, "This should be a country of the people, by the people, for the people." Do most Americans think this is a country of the people? I think you'd get a lot of argument about that. By the people? Are you kidding me? For the people, maybe, for some people, sometimes. So we're suggesting we add a proposition. What about with the people? What about government with the people? Now I don't mean volunteers to help the government do its job. I mean citizens doing their job in tandem with the government doing its job and taking advantage of Elinor Ostrom's Nobel Prize winning research, which is that there are some things that only citizens can do, and unless they do them, the institutions don't work. I see Larry Lee in the audience. Occasionally he will write about education. Occasionally he will upset people. I'm sure he doesn't intend to do that. But our schools could stand some improvement. And people are frustrated because they can't figure out how to make them better. At the same time, these overburdened, under-supported institutions suffer. In the community, there are all kinds of educational resources. I just gave you an example. Using songs from old-timers to create music to send back uses the community to teach. There are examples of community newspapers springing out of the local newspaper. There are examples of people building gardens and fish houses and using those because we know that what the community has is context. Context, and we know that context makes learning easier. Okay? It's been shown that you can learn the first lessons in math better in a supermarket where you go and shop than you can in the classroom. But we don't use the resources of the community to educate. It's difficult because the things the community supply don't show up on tests. They're not part of any recognized list of approved things to do. And so here we have one institution that's underperforming, and yet they're in communities that have all kinds of resources, and the two aren't coming together. They are not working with one another. Now, with is just an idea. It's not a prescription. It's not a list of things to do. It's simply a different way to think about our relationship to the government. And it's not so strange as it may seem to modern ears. Remember, and the lawyers in the crowd will appreciate that, in the Revolution, there was an effort to get rid of all of the vestiges of the British Empire, including the colleges that had been created, chartered by George III, Dartmouth College. They are in this audience, Dartmouth graduates. And the argument was, look, you folks at Dartmouth don't get it. There's a new sheriff in town. You're out of business. We'll form our own Republican institutions. We need leadership for a democracy. You wouldn't have any idea about that. Daniel Webster took the case, I believe, to the Supreme Court. And his famous line was, sirs, I realize Dartmouth is a small college, but there are those of us who love it. And the courts ruled that private entities could serve public purposes. Many of you work in those organizations, and you can use private funds for public good. It's one of the characteristics of the United States. But we're losing touch with that tradition. Everything is being deferred to some institution. If the kids don't learn, it's the school's problem. If people aren't healthy, it's the hospital's problem. If there's no justice in the land, it's the court's problems. So we have forfeited our heritage. So maybe it's time to consider with. We do it now of necessity. Anytime there's a hurricane and a tornado, you can see people working with one another. They've got to do it because the first responders can't get there. There's no road, there's no highway, there's no water, there's no electricity. So we do it in extreme situations. Maybe we ought to think about what it would mean in routines of institutions. I don't have any idea of what the application of the idea is, but we're trying to finish a study, and I think copies are available for the first chapter, that proposes that we add to Mr. Lincoln government of the people, by the people, for the people, and with the people. Now, as I was working on these remarks, off and on yesterday and up till 5 o'clock this morning, I couldn't get all of it to fall the right way. I realized I had to have a conclusion. And at 5 o'clock in the morning, I started thinking about Woodrow Wilson. I don't know how many of you were thinking about Woodrow Wilson this morning. 5 o'clock. But he said something that I think is appropriate to this occasion. He said, I believe in democracy because it engages the energies of everyone. I believe in democracy because it's the only system that engages the interest of energies of everyone. And that's why the United States is resilient. Not the first time in our history that people have written us off for one reason or the other. But this country has responded with resilience. You can see it happening now, Dayton, Hawaii, where we have one of our offices, one of these tragic mass shootings. See that community come together as never before to respond to that tragedy. Resilience. America is a resilient country because it is a democratic country. An authoritarian country is not going to have the flexibility to respond to ever-changing circumstances. So, I think we all are indebted to Mr. Wilson for his observation about the necessity of using the energies of everybody. Now, somebody accused him of being idealistic. He said, yes, I am idealistic. He said, that's how I know I'm an American. The one thing everybody in this room shares is that same idealism. We believe that what is now can be better than what it is, and we are determined, despite all, to find it. And that's what unites us. I thank you for your time.